Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're the show that plunges into significant global documents, conversations, really aiming to give you that shortcut to being genuinely well-informed.
That's the goal.
And today, our focus is on a continent whose global importance, well, it's just undeniable,
Yep.
Africa.
Absolutely.
We're talking about a region that's not just immense in its resources or its, rapidly growing population. It's a critical, active player, one that will, without a doubt, profoundly shape the future of our world.
You really can't overstate it.
The sheer scale of opportunity and also the challenge that Africa presents is, well, it's staggering. And it sets the stage perfectly for an illuminating look at how a major global power is recalibrating its approach, how it's thinking about this incredibly dynamic region.
That's right. And for this deep dive, our main source, the document we're really unpacking, is from August 2022. It's titled U.S. Strategy Toward Sub-Saharan Africa. And this isn't just some routine policy paper. It really signals a pretty profound reframing of how the U.S. views Africa, how it aims to engage. It seems to be moving quite decisively beyond, well, let's say traditional and maybe sometimes outdated approaches.
So our mission today is to really unpack the core insights, the strategic objectives, and the proposed new ways of doing things outlined in this document.
Exactly.
We want to help you uncover the significant shifts in priorities, those, aha moments about what this strategy means, not just for Africa, obviously, but for the broader global landscape.
And it's built on a particular belief, isn't it?
It seems so. It echoes what President Joe Biden said back in February 2021, something like, our nations, our people, the African Union, we're up to this task. That sentiment, that confidence, it really feels like it underpins the whole document, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. That statement sets a very deliberate tone. It's one of partnership, shared responsibility.
Yeah.
And, to your point about aha moments, understanding this strategy, it isn't just an exercise in geopolitics or, some dry foreign policy analysis.
Oh, no, not at all.
It's about grasping the fundamental forces that are shaping global issues that affect every single one of us, right? From how we tackle climate change or foster economic opportunity to bolstering democratic resilience and, crucially, ensuring global health security.
And the numbers are just staggering.
They really are. When you think about the fact that Africa is projected to host a quarter of the world's population by 2050, well, it becomes crystal clear why being well-informed about this region and how major players engage with it isn't just smart. It's absolutely essential to understanding the 21st century.
That's a powerful way to frame it. So, okay, let's unpack the strategy. To really get the nuances, we first need to appreciate the strategic environment it's operating in. The document makes it incredibly clear. Africa's importance to global priorities is, frankly, irreplaceable.
Yeah, irreplaceable is the word they use. It's not just a region. It's framed as a critical global engine.
So what does that engine look like?
Well, when we look at Africa today, we are genuinely looking at a demographic and economic powerhouse in the making. The statistics alone kind of compelling picture.
Give us some of those.
Okay, so it has one of the world's fastest growing populations. It's projected to be 25% of the global population by 2050. Just, try to imagine the sheer scale of human capital there. The innovation potential, the possibilities that represents for the coming decades.
That demographic dividend is just huge. And economically, it's not just potential, right? There's real momentum now.
There really is. Look at the African Continental Free Trade Area, the AFCFTA. Once that's fully implemented, it has the potential to become the world's fifth largest economy. We're talking a combined GDP of over $3.4 trillion.
Wow. That's a truly massive market taking shape.
It is. But importantly, the strategy doesn't just focus on the raw numbers. It specifically highlights this vibrant continent-wide spirit of entrepreneurship. Innovation, too, particularly among its incredibly youthful population. That's seen as a major engine for the projected growth.
So it's not just population size, it's dynamism, human ingenuity driving new opportunity.
Exactly. And beyond the human element, the markets, you've got the continent's natural resources and its geographic significance. Both are immense.
Let's talk about resources.
Okay, Africa's home to the world's second largest rainforest. That's a critical carbon sink, vital for global climate stability, right?
Absolutely vital.
And think about this. It holds 30% of the critical minerals, the stuff that's absolutely essential for modern technology.
Like what specifically?
Everything. Rare earth elements in your smartphone, the cobalt in electric vehicle batteries, components for renewable energy.
Uh-huh.
It's all there.
And geographically.
Its strategic location is undeniable. It
Right.
sits along major sea lines of communication and trade. The Atlantic Ocean, the Indian Ocean, the Gulf of Aden. It's a nexus for global commerce and security. You just can't ignore it.
And this is where it gets really interesting for me. Africa's diplomatic and multilateral influence is also clearly expanding. The document mentions it holds 3 non-permanent seats in the UN Security Council, and its combined votes, that's one of the largest regional voting groups, right? Something like 28% at the UN and other bodies.
That's a significant block.
Yeah.
Real leverage in global decision-making.
But beyond just the numbers, what does that growing influence actually mean in practice? How does it change global governance?
Well, what's really fascinating here, and maybe an aha moment for some listeners, is the increasing recognition of African leadership on the global stage, not just in regional bodies, but in truly global institutions.
Like the WHO and WTO?
Exactly. We're seeing Africans at the helm of major international bodies like the World Health Organization, the World Trade Organization, and this isn't just symbolic. It reflects, I think, a growing confidence, a growing capacity for African nations to lead on really complex global challenges, to shape the agenda, not just react to it.
Which forces a rethink from other powers.
It absolutely does. It forces a recalibration of how major powers interact, moving away from a sort of prescriptive role towards one of genuine collaboration,
Yeah.
partnership.
That makes perfect sense. So, okay, with this growing importance, this expanding influence, it's maybe not surprising that there's a heightened global contest for influence playing out across the continent.
Definitely. The strategy explicitly notes that the world is keenly aware of Africa's importance,
Hmm.
and that awareness is spurring many countries to expand their engagement, political, economic, security engagement.
Which creates a complex dynamic. Opportunities, but also challenges for African nations trying to navigate this.
Precisely. And the document draws some distinctions. It clarifies that traditional allies and partners, think Europe, the Middle East, the Indo-Pacific, they increasingly view Africa as integral to their own national security, their own economic prosperity.
And they want to work with the U.S.
Crucially, yeah.
Yeah.
Many of them are committed, according to the strategy, to working with the U.S. on investments that meet certain criteria. High standards, values-driven, transparent. It suggests a kind of preferred alignment, prioritizing quality, shared principles, and how they engage.
But then you have the competing agendas. The strategy is quite direct about the People's Republic of China, the PRC, and Russia. It portrays their approaches as distinctly different from this U.S.-led model.
Very different.
It details the U.S. view, that the PRC sees Africa as an arena to challenge what the document calls the rules-based international order. Maybe unpack that term a bit for us.
Sure. So, rules-based international order, generally, it refers to the system of international laws, norms, institutions that have largely governed global affairs since World War II, focusing on cooperation, agreed-upon principles.
Okay. So how does the strategy say that PRC challenges this in Africa?
Well, the strategy asserts that the PRC advances its own narrow commercial and geopolitical interests, and often it suggests in ways that undermine transparency and openness.
And the goal from the U.S. perspective presented here.
The document suggests this ultimately aims to weaken U.S. relations with African peoples and governments. It's basically a critique of their methods, implying a less collaborative, more self-serving approach.
And Russia. How is their approach described? Equally distinct.
Yes, but with different tools, different methods. The strategy describes Russia as viewing the region as a permissive environment.
Permissive for what?
For its parastatals, that's state-owned or state-controlled enterprises, and also for private military companies. Wagner being the obvious example, though not explicitly named perhaps.
Right.
And these entities, the strategy states, are often seen as fomenting instability, doing so for strategic gain, but also for financial benefit.
How do they do that?
It specifically points out Russia's use of security ties, economic ties, combined with a significant flow of disinformation, particularly aimed at undercutting African opposition to Russia's actions, like the invasion of Ukraine.
So a very different set of motivations and methods compared to the U.S. and its traditional allies, which raises the question, how do African nations navigate these competing visions for their future? That must be incredibly difficult.
It's a huge challenge, absolutely. So while it's clear Africa is this continent of immense opportunity, growing influence, the strategy doesn't shy away from acknowledging the significant challenges it faces.
No, it seems quite realistic on that front.
In fact, it highlights how many positive developments, things that were moving in the right direction, have been blunted by a convergence of compounding crises.
That's a critical point, a convergence.
Right.
What are these converging crises, and what makes them so particularly devastating for progress?
You're looking at armed conflict in multiple regions, the spread of terrorism, the very real impacts of climate change, widespread food insecurity, and then layered on top the severe socioeconomic fallout from the COVID-19 pandemic, all hitting at once.
That's a perfect storm.
It really is. The strategy explicitly states that these challenges combined have set back 20 years of hard-won development gains across the continent.
20 years, that's huge.
It leads to unprecedented levels of displacement, unprecedented levels of hunger. It paints a picture of really substantial headwinds, despite all that underlying potential we just talked about.
The aha moment there is realizing progress isn't guaranteed. It's not linear. Shocks, internal vulnerabilities, they can quickly erode years of effort.
Exactly. And these aren't abstract problems, are they? They manifest as very real human suffering.
The document lists specifics, doesn't it?
It does. Specific areas of ongoing conflict, humanitarian crises, Cameroon, the DRC, Ethiopia, Mozambique, Nigeria, Somalia, right across the Sahel region.
A huge swath of the continent.
And this fragility, this instability, it notes, provides fertile ground for terrorist groups like ISIS and al-Qaeda to expand their activities. That poses a real and persistent threat, not just to African stability, but to U.S. persons and interests, too.
What's also concerning, and maybe a deeper insight from the strategy, is this issue of democratic backsliding.
Yeah, that's a major theme.
Despite apparently strong popular support for democracy in sub-Saharan Africa, the document cites polling around 69%. The continent has seen a really troubling string of military coups, democratic setbacks in recent years.
It's led to a significant contraction of civic space, political space in some areas.
And the strategy offers a nuanced take on why, right? It doesn't just blame external actors.
Right. It acknowledges that public dissatisfaction with how democracy is performing, how it's delivering or not delivering for citizens, often provides a pretext for these coups. It recognizes internal vulnerabilities, not just external manipulation.
It cites an alarming statistic, too.
Yes, that in 2022, Freedom House classified only 8 sub-Saharan African countries as free. That's the fewest since 1991, a really stark indicator of the trend.
And these setbacks, the document argues, they widen the openings for, well, undue foreign influence.
They do, and they reflect a rise in the exploitation of surveillance technology, the spread of disinformation, pervasive corruption, ongoing human rights violations. It's all interconnected, a complex web.
Now, the strategy does acknowledge some democratic bright spots, places like Malawi and Zambia.
Yes, it contrasts those successes with autocratic leaders elsewhere who are managing to retain a tight hold on power, often using exactly those tools: surveillance, repression, disinformation.
Which creates volatility.
Absolutely. You get this widening gap between what the public wants, greater freedoms, opportunity, and the reality of closing civic space in some countries. That fuels protest movements, fuels instability. The strategy clearly recognizes this inherent tension, and it's a critical challenge for this new U.S. approach to address.
Okay, so given this incredibly complex environment, the opportunities, the challenges, the competing influences, the U.S. strategy lays out 4 core objectives, 4 pillars to guide its engagement.
That's right. And it emphasizes that the U.S. isn't planning to go it alone. It will pursue these objectives in close coordination with allies, partners, institutions.
Acknowledging both the immense potential and those persistent challenges we've discussed. Conflict, corruption, mismanagement, food insecurity, repression. It sounds like an ambitious blueprint.
It truly is. The first objective, foster openness and open societies, feels foundational.
What's the core interest there, according to the document?
It's about ensuring Africa remains open, accessible, allowing governments and publics to make their own political choices, consistent with international obligations, of course.
And the rationale. Why is openness so important from the U.S. perspective?
Well, the document is quite clear. Open societies are generally more inclined to partner with the U.S. They tend to attract greater, more transparent investment. They usually improve conditions for their own citizens. And importantly, they're better equipped to counter those negative foreign activities that try to exploit closed systems.
So how does this strategy propose to achieve that openness? In practical terms, it talks about concrete actions, right? Promoting transparency, accountability.
Yes, things like working directly with African governments, but also civil society groups and the public. Supporting investigative journalism, for example. Combating digital authoritarianism, that use of tech for repression. Trying to help enshrine laws and practices that genuinely promote democratic norms.
And it mentions corruption specifically.
Explicitly, combating pervasive corruption, improving fiscal transparency, exposing illicit financial flows, supporting reforms. It links directly to the broader U.S. strategy on countering corruption. This seems like a renewed emphasis, recognizing maybe how corruption fuels so many other problems.
And a key part of openness is the rule of law.
Absolutely crucial. An often overlooked aspect? Maybe. The strategy highlights an increasing focus on rule of law, on justice, on dignity as ways to deepen resilience.
Oh, so?
It specifically points to independent judiciaries, seeing them as a vital bulwark against democratic backsliding.
Because they can?
They can prevent illegal constitutional changes, potentially stop embezzlement, thwart stolen elections. And critically, they provide that crucial avenue for citizens to seek redress when human rights are abused. Judicial independence is framed as non-negotiable for real openness.
The strategy also connects this first objective to natural resources and food security. How does that fit?
Well, the idea is to help African countries leverage their vast natural resources energy, those critical minerals we mentioned, but to do it transparently, for sustainable development, not just extraction for someone else's benefit.
And strengthening supply chains in the process.
Yes, diverse, open, predictable supply chains. And on food security, it's about tackling the root causes, boosting food production to mitigate the risks of famine malnutrition. It notes the UN estimate nearly 800 million Africans affected, a staggering human cost that ties directly back to governance and stability.
It really highlights the interconnectedness of these issues. Okay, let's move to the second objective. Deliver democratic and security dividends.
Right. And here, the strategy explicitly identifies these strong linkages between poor governance, rampant corruption, human rights abuses, and it specifically calls out sexual and gender-based violence and the widespread insecurity we see in parts of the continent.
And these vulnerabilities are exploited.
Exactly. By terrorist groups, by malign foreign actors. So the thinking is, by addressing these challenges together and by showing that democracy can deliver tangible benefits for citizens.
You offer a better alternative.
Precisely. You offer compelling choices to Africans, you limit the openings for those negative actors, and ideally, you make costly interventions less necessary down the line.
So how do they plan to stem this tide of authoritarianism, reverse the backsliding? What are the tools?
The strategy talks about working with allies, using a mix of targeted inducements, carrots, and punitive measures like sanction sticks in response to democratic backsliding or military takeovers.
And addressing that public dissatisfaction.
Yes, explicitly acknowledging the need to address public frustration when democracy doesn't seem to be delivering. Because, as we said, that can provide the pretext for coup.
It also mentions supporting civil society.
Very strongly. Supporting civil society, empowering marginalized groups. It mentions LGBTQI+ individuals, specifically centering the voices of women and youth, defending free and fair elections. It builds on initiatives like the Presidential Initiative for Democratic Renewal. It sounds like a broad, inclusive approach on paper.
And on the security side of this objective, strengthening African capacity.
Yes, significant emphasis there, focusing diplomatic tools, development aid, and defense resources to help partners respond to the drivers of conflict themselves.
The goal being
Improving the capacity of African partners to advance regional stability and security. But crucially, through security actors, police, military that are more professional, more capable, and importantly, more accountable to their own people and laws.
less impunity.
That's the aim. It also commits to investing in locally led prevention and peace-building efforts, leveraging things like the Global Fragility Act in places like coastal West Africa, Mozambique, trying to shift towards a more localized, sustainable approach to security rather than just externally driven responses.
And counterterrorism, CT, still a priority.
Still a priority, yes. But the strategy frames it as directing resources to reduce threats to the U.S. homeland, its people, its facilities, primarily by working by, with, and through African partners.
Partnership is key.
Seems to be the watchword. They also promote civilian-led, non-kinetic approaches where possible, building the capacity of local partners' security, intelligence, judicial institutions to handle threats themselves, identify, disrupt, degrade, share information. It's framed as a comprehensive approach, but emphasizing partnership over unilateral action.
Okay, that makes sense. Let's move to the third objective. Advance pandemic recovery and economic opportunity. This feels very immediate. very tangible.
It does. And the commitment stems directly from the immediate and, well, the long-term helps and economic challenges the continent faces, especially the impacts of COVID-19, its lingering economic and social
Which
consequences.
were then made worse.
Exactly. Compounded by ongoing global supply chain issues and then the escalating food insecurity driven by Russia's war in Ukraine. So the strategy argues that U.S. support for an equitable recovery is absolutely crucial. For rebuilding trust, yes, but also for increasing trade, investment, creating jobs both in Africa and for American businesses.
So on health security specifically, what's the plan?
The strategy prioritizes policies to end the acute phase of COVID-19, obviously, but also to significantly enhance health security overall, closing critical gaps in African countries' own preparedness and response capacities.
It mentions vaccine efforts.
Yes, it notes that by July 2022, about 25% of Africans had received at least one dose and highlights the U.S. providing over 200 million doses.
Sir.
The plan is to continue supporting vaccine delivery, encourage uptake, support the whole COVID response diagnostics, surveillance, training.
That sounds like continuing urgent aid. What about building longer-term capacity so this doesn't happen again?
That's really where the deeper commitment lies in this objective. Beyond the immediate COVID response, it includes building core capacities to prevent, detect, and respond to future infectious disease threats.
Yeah.
Supporting manufacturing initiatives for vaccines, other medical countermeasures on the continent itself, strengthening global supply chains to prevent future disruptions. Public-private partnerships are key here, as is supporting regional leadership like the Africa Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. It's about building self-sufficiency, building resilience from within.
And on the economic side of this objective, growth and debt.
The plan is to work with African countries to foster a stronger growth trajectory and also tackle debt sustainability, using multilateral institutions, global partners to help.
And that big G7 initiative is mentioned.
Yes, the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment, PGII, the G7 commitment to mobilize $600 billion globally. The goal there is delivering game-changing projects in Africa, diversifying supply chains. And this is meant to complement existing U.S. efforts like Prosper Africa, Power Africa, Feed the Future, plus a new digital transformation initiative. It signals a major push on investment.
It sounds like it.
And finally, within this objective, there's a really significant focus on rebuilding human capital and food systems. Both were hit hard by the pandemic and the Ukraine war.
What does rebuilding human capital mean here?
Partnering to stop further declines, addressing vulnerabilities in household income, food security, helping kids, especially girls, get back to school, and critically, preparing African youth for a 21st century economy, equipping them with relevant skills, expertise. It's a fundamental investment in the continent's future strength.
Okay, the fourth and final core objective, and one that's increasingly vital everywhere: support conservation, climate adaptation, and a just energy transition.
Absolutely vital, and the strategy explicitly emphasizes that Africa's own efforts to conserve its ecosystems, its natural resources, are central to tackling the global climate crisis.
But it highlights a paradox here, doesn't it?
It does, quite starkly. It highlights that Africa is responsible for extremely low emissions per capita, far, far less than industrialized nations. Yet it stands to suffer some of the most severe effects of climate change.
Like droughts, floods.
Exactly. Extreme droughts, devastating floods, sea level rise. This underscores both a moral and a practical imperative to support the continent, helping it adapt to and mitigate climate impacts even as its energy demands inevitably increase to support crucial economic growth. It's a fundamental challenge for the whole world, really.
So what does this mean in terms of concrete actions laid out in the strategy, conservation first?
They plan to partner on conserving, managing, restoring Africa's rich natural ecosystems. That directly helps reduce global carbon emissions, dampens climate change impacts for everyone. They're also expanding efforts to combat wildlife trafficking and illegal, unreported, unregulated fishing, IUU fishing, which devastate ecosystems and local livelihoods.
And supporting local efforts.
Yes, backing climate champions through existing U.S. initiatives, like the Plan to Conserve Global Forests and the Central Africa Regional Program for the Environment.
What about energy? That's the tricky part, balancing development needs with climate goals.
It is. The strategy says the U.S. will work closely with countries to meet their specific energy needs. That includes energy efficiency, definitely renewable energy, but also acknowledges gas-to-power infrastructure where appropriate and consistent with U.S. climate policies.
And the emphasis is on a just transition. What does that mean?
It means not just shifting to renewables, but doing it in a way that creates economic opportunities and mitigates the social impacts for local populations, not just burdening them with the costs of a global problem they contributed very little to. It also involves harnessing U.S. and African private sector investment for this transition, for diversification, for energy security.
And climate adaptation, helping countries cope with impacts already happening.
Yes, under the President's Emergency Plan for Adaptation and Resilience Prepare, the U.S. will continue working with African governments that are acutely exposed, helping them respond at scale.
And this ties back to critical minerals again.
It does, pursuing public-private partnerships for sustainable development and securing those critical minerals needed for clean energy tech. But the strategy stresses doing this transparently, upholding human rights, upholding environmental safeguards, trying to ensure resource wealth benefits the country, not just external actors, and is done responsibly, aligning economic goals with ethical practices.
That seems like a crucial connection. Okay, moving now to part 3 of the strategy document. It takes a moment for some critical self-reflection, looking back at 3 decades of U.S. policy toward Africa.
Yes, it acknowledges a long, proud history of bipartisan U.S. support engagement, built on deep cultural connections, shared goals. It feels important to understand the context, what came before, and maybe where past approaches fell short in today's world.
Absolutely. And there have been significant past achievements. The document details some big ones.
Huge ones. U.S. partnerships helping over 20 million people with HIV/AIDS through PEPFAR, preventing over 1 billion malaria cases through PMI, helping defeat the Ebola outbreak in West Africa, electrifying 29 million homes and businesses through Power Africa.
And trade, AGOA.
Yes, the African Growth and Opportunity Act, AGOA, from back in 2000, credited with improving export competitiveness for many African products, creating tens of thousands of jobs. Plus, U.S. support for democracy, contributing to expanded political rights in the 90s, 2000s, and the establishment of Africa Command in 2007. So a lot of positive impact acknowledged.
But then comes the critical self-assessment. Where did things fall short?
The strategy is quite frank here. It states that despite these vital contributions, long-standing approaches are now seen as insufficient for a more contested, more competitive global environment.
How so?
It notes that U.S. democracy promotion efforts, peace and security efforts have struggled to show the desired impact recently, citing examples like leaders amending constitutions to stay in power, repressing political opponents.
And counterterrorism.
While the approach has removed high-value targets, the strategy admits the threat of terrorism has stubbornly persisted, even expanded in some areas. The aha moment here is perhaps the candid admission that past successes don't automatically guarantee future relevance. The world changed, the continent changed.
That candid assessment, then, it leads logically to a clear commitment to modernize, right?
Exactly. The strategy reflects a real determination to revitalize, to modernize the traditional tools of statecraft, diplomacy, defense, development, to advance U.S. interests effectively across this changing continent. It's a clear signal. Continuity isn't enough. There needs to be an evolution in approach.
Which brings us to what the strategy calls a 21st century U.S.-African partnership. It sounds like a new mindset is required.
That's the core idea. The imperative is to genuinely reset relations with African counterparts, to listen more profoundly to diverse local voices, to widen the circle of engagement, all for mutual benefit. This feels like a crucial shift in philosophy from some past models which might have been perceived as more prescriptive.
One key aspect of this reset is framed as elevate the U.S.-African partnership. What does that mean in practice?
It means collaborating, engaging African partners on global priorities, not just issues siloed off as African problems. Thinking about pandemics, climate change, food security, supply chains as shared global challenges where African leadership is essential.
And broadening engagement.
Yes, broadening senior-level engagements, and importantly, addressing disagreements head-on when they arise, not papering over them. It implies a relationship aiming for equality, even when differences occur.
Another significant shift highlighted is to engage more African states, not just the big players.
Exactly. The strategy emphasizes broadening engagement beyond just the largest states, deepening relations with small and medium-sized African states to advance shared priorities, including supporting the African Union's own Agenda 2063 vision.
Why the shift?
It explicitly states that safeguarding U.S. national security interests requires just as much engagement with smaller countries as with the larger ones, and also engaging emerging African democracies. It's a recognition that influence, stability, opportunity, they aren't just concentrated in a few capitals.
And a crucial component seems to be bolster civil society.
Yes, very strong emphasis here. The strategy argues that advancing U.S. objectives is more likely if the region's civil society journalists, activists, democratic institutions, multilateral bodies are empowered to stand up for shared democratic values, like transparency, accountability, equality.
It also makes a connection to racial justice.
It does, which is quite striking and modern. It explicitly recognizes the historical and ongoing connections between racial justice and equality in sub-Saharan Africa and in the United States. It's a powerful acknowledgement of shared history and linked struggles.
The strategy also aims to transcend geographic seams. What does that mean, breaking down old silos?
Pretty much facilitating new geographic groupings, deepening engagement with multilateral institutions like the AU, expanding partnerships with other foreign players. It wants to integrate African states into broader forums, Indian Ocean discussions, Indo-Pacific strategies, coastal Atlantic cooperation,
And internally within the U.S. government.
addressing those artificial bureaucratic divisions that sometimes separate, say, North Africa from sub-Saharan Africa policy, seeing Africa more as a whole and deeply connected to broader global networks.
Now, here's something really interesting. The strategy emphasizes engaging America's African diaspora.
Yes, this is a notable inclusion. The diaspora is highlighted as a source of strength. That includes African Americans with deep historical ties, but also the nearly 2 million African immigrants in the U.S. who often maintain very close familial, social, economic connections back to the continent.
And the AU recognizes the diaspora, too.
It does. The African Union even classifies the global African diaspora as its symbolic sixth region.
So what does this recognition mean practically for the strategy? How will they engage the diaspora?
The plan is to elevate this engagement, strengthen dialogue between U.S. officials and diaspora communities here in the States, support initiatives like the UN's Permanent Forum for People of African Descent. The goal is to better explain U.S. policies, combat misinformation, foster partnerships, deepen mutual understanding. It's about recognizing and leveraging this powerful, often untapped bridge for diplomacy, those deeply personal connections.
Another fascinating aspect is the intention to leverage U.S. private sector and domestic leadership, connecting foreign policy back home.
Right. The U.S. government plans to increase its partnership with the U.S. private sector on African initiatives, but also work with states, cities, communities across America to show how this foreign policy benefits the American middle class.
They give examples.
Yeah, like San Francisco's public employee retirement system investing $100 million in African power projects, or the Michigan National Guard training staff at a military hospital in Liberia through the State Partnership Program. They also plan to facilitate more travel for African leaders beyond just D.C. or New York, fostering broader connections across the U.S. It creates a tangible link. Foreign policy isn't just over there.
Okay, so that sets the stage for our approach, the section on driving innovation and implementation. How do they plan to actually do all this?
Yeah, this is about translating the vision into actionable steps. The U.S. says it will prioritize innovation, partner with Africans to tackle shared global challenges, recognizing Africa as increasingly connected, urban, and youthful.
First up is revamping public diplomacy.
Yes, revamp public diplomacy efforts, modernizing the tools, empowering ambassadors and officials on the ground to engage publics, especially youth and women, in more accessible, creative ways, not just government-to-government talk.
More cultural exchange, too.
Encouraging more cultural exchanges, yes. It cites Ghana's successful Year of Return festivities as a positive example. It feels like a move away from just official statements towards fostering genuine connection, building bridges at a grassroots level, maybe something that was missing or under-resourced in past approaches.
And critically, the strategy commits to support sustainable development and resilience, building on existing aid.
Building on it, but also accelerating attention to reducing risk and improving state and institutional resilience, especially after the shocks of the pandemic. They'll deepen work with governments, regional bodies, focusing on what they call sustainable development accelerators.
Like what?
Things like digital transformation in financial services, targeted investments in health system capacity, improving supply chains for critical commodities, expanding electricity access, creating sustainable jobs. Recognizing the U.S. is already the largest bilateral development donor, but planning to innovate with more tailored approaches.
They also plan to refine and reinvest in U.S. defense tools. This sounds like a delicate balance.
It is. The strategy acknowledges that effective, legitimate, accountable militaries and security forces are essential for open, democratic, resilient societies. So they'll review and reinvest in tools for engaging with African militaries.
Focusing on.
Programs supporting institutional capacity building, combating corruption within the security sector, advancing security sector reforms. But it also explicitly states the U.S. will condemn human rights violations and coups by security forces, integrating these issues into dialogues. It's trying to walk that line. Support security capacity, but demand accountability.
Tricky.
Very. And notably, the Department of Defense is tasked with engaging partners to expose and highlight the risks of negative PRC and Russian activities in Africa, reinforcing that competitive element we talked about. It also mentions leveraging civil defense institutions, expanding cooperation with key partners, building capacity on climate risk for defense forces, and even engaging the U.S. defense private sector via Prosper Africa for sustainable tech and energy solutions for African militaries.
Okay, next, strengthening trade and commercial relations, building on existing programs.
Yes, building on Power Africa, Prosper Africa, the PGII initiative, the digital transformation push, aiming to significantly increase U.S. investment and trade with Africa, not just in Africa.
Focusing on specific sectors.
Yes, sectors that align with U.S. priorities, but also African needs. Agribusiness, energy, entertainment, Nollywood, for example, healthcare, technology. The goal is facilitating legitimate trade and travel, securing borders, deepening trade relationships through negotiations.
And AGOA's future, the AFCFTA.
Crucial points. They commit to working actively with Congress on the future of AGA, which expires in 2025, and providing support for the ongoing implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area. Both are absolutely vital for fostering equitable prosperity through trade, helping Africa compete globally.
Another major pillar is drive digital transformation. This feels huge.
It is. The strategy aims to foster a digital ecosystem across sub-Saharan Africa built on an open, reliable, interoperable, and secure internet and information and communication technology, ICT.
U.S. companies are already investing.
They are. The strategy notes U.S. private sector investment in things like undersea cables, data centers. The U.S. government will advocate for affordable internet access and open technology platforms like Open RAN.
But it's not just about infrastructure, right? There are human and governance implications.
Exactly. The digital focus also extends to expanding digital democracy programming, defending against digital authoritarianism, that use of tech to suppress dissent or control populations, combating disinformation, fighting online harassment, establishing clear cyberspace conduct standards.
Thin skills.
Yes, leveraging U.S. universities, the private sector, to facilitate online STEM courses for African youth. A powerful investment in human capital, future innovation, making sure the digital revolution benefits people broadly.
Finally, a really innovative-sounding approach. Rebalance toward urban hubs. Shifting focus.
It seems so. Consistent with President Biden's focus on urban renewal here in the U.S., the plan is to help African cities plan for their rapid growth, focusing on critical sectors within cities: energy access, climate adaptation, transportation, water, waste management. Given how fast Africa is urbanizing, this feels very pragmatic.
A shift away from only dealing with national governments.
It looks like a significant shift towards more granular engagement, a clear commitment to subnational capacity building. They plan to borrow from the Millennium Challenge Corporation, the MCC, model,
How would that work with cities?
working directly with municipal governments, doing joint analysis to figure out the biggest constraints to growth, then establishing time-bound municipal compacts with joint progress indicators. They even mention a forthcoming MCC threshold program with a major African city to test this approach. It signals a real shift to more localized direct partnerships. That feels like an aha moment, recognizing real change often happens block by block, city by city.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, it feels right to circle back to that address President Biden gave to the African Union back in 2021.
Yeah, the tone he set there seems really reflected throughout this strategy document.
He reiterated how interconnected our world is, how our fates are truly bound together. Africa's peace and prosperity aren't just good for Africa, they're prerequisites for solving global problems, and by extension, for our own ability to solve them.
Exactly. Progress depends on working together, elevating African leadership. He noted, none of this is going to be easy, but he affirmed there is no doubt that our nations, our people, the African Union, were up to this task.
That sentiment really does seem to underpin this whole strategy, a shift from maybe a historical view of Africa primarily as a recipient of aid.
To seeing it as a critical, active, indispensable partner on the global stage. It feels like a move from a relationship that was perhaps sometimes transactional towards one based on deeper mutual interest, long-term partnership.
So, As you, our listeners, reflect on this comprehensive strategy, maybe consider this. What does this detailed blueprint imply about the evolving global power dynamics? Not just between the big states like the US, China, Russia, but in recognizing the full active agency of African nations themselves.
That's a great question. And how might this shift in approach, this focus on mutual interests, diverse partnerships, civil society, diaspora, cities, how might that fundamentally reshape our understanding of international cooperation in a world that's changing so fast?
And maybe on a personal level, how can we stay informed about these specific initiatives as they hopefully roll out? How can we recognize Africa's growing influence beyond the often negative headlines? Perhaps even look for opportunities ourselves to engage with African innovations perspectives directly.
A lot to contemplate for sure, and definitely a dynamic, important region to keep watching closely.
That's all for this deep dive. Thanks so much for joining us. We'll be back soon with more insights.